Welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be discussing a lot of things not as deeply as I would like. My initial plan for today was to discuss what's going on in Colombia at great length. It is fascinating. It is truly massive changes for Latin America are possible. Massive changes for U.S. foreign policy towards Latin and South America are possible because of Colombia. However, events have intervened, and while I will start off today talking about Colombia in more of a surface way, there are also events in Iraq and Ethiopia that I know people were going to ask about, so I had to get up to speed on those a bit as well. So today is going to be a little lighter in coverage than I like these big public lives to be. It's going to be a little bit more like the patrons' news chats. But it's going to cover a lot of material and hopefully we'll cover even more in the question and answer period. Before we get into it, talking about Colombia, Iraq, and Ethiopia, a few ground rules. If you're new to the YouTube stream, you'll see that there is a chat, a place where you can chat. The rules in there are pretty simple. You're allowed to say anything you want about ideas, about things that I'm saying, about me personally. You want to make fun of me, go for it, what have you. However, you are not allowed to attack each other and you are not allowed to disrupt the chat. You've got to treat that pretty well. Can someone in the chat let me know whether or not this is coming through okay? I'm not hearing anything on the chat yet. Want to make sure that you guys see me and hear me. Basically, observe that civility, be pleasant to each other. If you are not, then Logo Cool Extreme, our moderator, will tell you that you are not being adequately civil or not being adequately observing the rules, and there is no appeal from the court of Loga. So do what he says. Okay, great. Happy to hear it's coming through. We are about to get into it. Colombia is a fascinating developments in Colombia. Many countries in Latin America have an antagonistic relationship with the United States, U.S. foreign policy, for very good reasons, pretty dark Cold War legacies. Colombia had been an exception to that until June of 2022. It's interesting, I took a brief look at Colombian politics, not as deep as I wanted to, but it's fascinating looking at the alternation of power, certainly in this century, and I believe in the 20th century as well. Because Colombia was under the pressures of a vicious civil war, it seems like up until 2022, almost all of the governments, certainly in the 21st century, were to some degree operating very hand in hand with the U.S. government. This can be confusing because if you look at Santos, the predecessor to Duque, the guy who just got turfed out by Gustavo Petro, within that context of being pro-American and working with the United States, there was a wide range of political discussion. Uribe, still a very powerful figure in Colombian politics, a right-wing figure, initially was a big supporter of Santos and then turned against Santos when Santos made a few minorly more left-leaning or not hyper-conservative choices. And then Duque became the candidate of the right-wing reaction to Santos, even though Santos is a rich white guy, very much a part of the Colombian establishment, and made choices like peace with FARC, an attempt to end the decades-long Colombian Civil War. Those very small, centrist, just not crazy right-wing decisions on his part turned him into a hate figure. So Santos, though Duque ran against Santos's legacy, Santos was nowhere near the president of Colombia between 2010 and 2018, was nowhere near as left-wing, nowhere near as disruptive, nowhere near as potentially destabilizing to Colombia's traditional role and role with the United States as Gustavo Petro, the guy who was elected on June 19th. Petro is a fascinating figure. It's often pointed out that he was at one point an armed guerrilla. He, of course, renounced that back in 1990. So we're talking a guy who has not been an armed guerrilla for 32 years. He's an economist. He is certainly, however, much more left-leaning and much more interested in disrupting the regular run of business in Colombia than potentially any Colombian president has been for decades and decades and decades. This is a huge deal. But what's interesting about that, before I talk about some of the things that he's doing, what's I think needs to be discussed is the limitations of, how far can a Colombia left-wing president go? To be clear, it's not an overwhelming mandate that this guy won. And what he's capitalizing on, what the mandate he has, is for change. It's not necessarily a mandate for sweeping left-wing change, no matter how much he may be interested in that himself. He only won 51% of the vote against a similarly populist but very right-leaning, some would say somewhat lunatic, opponent in the runoff election. Duque, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his names, did not run again, supposedly for term limits, but also because of extraordinary unpopularity. Colombia was very hard hit by the COVID pandemic. It is, to a degree, a petroleum state, so it's probably not hit quite as hard with rising oil and gas costs as others, but it has had a really, really difficult time under COVID. Duque came into power in 2018 in a sort of right-wing reaction against Santos's attempt to make peace with long-term communist guerrillas. But I think it's fair to say that his 4 years in power may have discredited this, let's be tough and mean and punitive instinct among folks, because things in Colombia are just so screwed up that I don't think people are that concerned about keeping the violence going the way they were when they put Duque in power. Already, so all that is to say that Petro absolutely has a mandate to make change, but does he have a mandate to make extreme left-wing change, as he might be interested in? That's an open question. It's interesting looking at his actions thus far, because with the headlines, Gustavo Petro's actions as president thus far, he only took office on August 7th. His actions thus far, the headlines seem very huge and very massive, but then when you drill down on the details, they're not actually quite as out there or crazy as you might expect, and I think that's a sign that he's being sensible about this. I've talked earlier about the question of, is this Latin American pink wave, is this South American pink wave smarter than the last one? In the 2000s, a range of left-leaning politicians came to power in places like Bolivia, Venezuela, Argentina, Ecuador. And they were very loud and out there about opposing U.S. imperialism. It was a good time to oppose U.S. imperialism because, A, the United States was doing tremendously evil stuff in the Middle East. We still are today, but it's not as well publicized. And the U.S. was tremendously distracted by the tremendously evil stuff that we were doing in the Middle East. So folks like Chavez, Evo Morales, the Kirchners, is it Correa in Ecuador, were much more loud and angry about their dissension and their disappointment and resentment of the United States. What's interesting about Boric in Chile, Petro in Colombia, is perhaps looking at the horrific example of how badly Chavez and Maduro were burned by their adversarial positioning. Boric in Chile at least, and it seems like Petro is interested in stepping a little bit more lightly. And it's an interesting question, especially in Colombia, that has had this really tight-knit cooperation with the United States for a long period of time. I would argue much more deeply intertwined. The Colombian and U.S. security establishments are much more deeply entwined than the Mexican and the U.S. security establishments. Though, of course, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration is very present in Mexico as well. In Colombia, that degree of intelligence, military, and Drug Enforcement Administration cooperation has gotten to a much higher degree not just in terms of personnel and money. The amount of money that the DEA spends on Colombia is large by the standards of drug interdiction, and it seemed like a massive amount of money in the 90s, but by the standards of the U.S. military-industrial complex today, it's rather low. But that can be misleading because it's not just the DEA, it's military cooperation, it's intelligence cooperation. As the Trump administration most visibly, but also the Obama, Bush, and Biden administrations have taken a more and more hostile approach to Venezuela, of course, intelligence cooperation with Colombia has gone up as well, and that's probably outside of the imprimatur of the DEA. So Colombia has been the United States, up until this week or so, Colombia had been the most staunch ally of the United States in opposing Venezuela. Of course, Venezuela and Colombia share a border. That may have changed, but what's interesting is the extent to which, because of this decades of cooperation, not only is Colombia kind of on the hook with the United States because of a high amount of international aid, intelligence cooperation, military cooperation, that Petro doesn't want to instantly disappear, there's also real legislative interactions between Colombia and the United States that are really hard to disentangle. Let's turn to drugs. I think there were some really big headlines about how, I might have been guilty of this myself, about how Colombia was going to end the drug war. Having dived into the details a bit more over the past couple days, that's not exactly what's being proposed here. Two things can be true at the same time. What Petro is proposing for the drug war is a seismic, massive, extraordinary shift that probably puts him in danger, both from crazy right-wing elements within Colombia and quite possibly from the U.S. national security state. It's a huge thing. That can be true, but also what he's proposing is rather incremental. It's small changes in policies. He is not talking about legalization of cocaine, which I was a bit confused about earlier. He's talking about decriminalization of cocaine. Of course, that would have massive, massive effects, but still. And he's very consciously, in his introduction of these concepts, is talking about not taking unilateral steps as Colombia, but getting international conferences and more international weight around decriminalization and changing the failed drug war. The drug war is quite simply failed. This was one of the issues that got me into internet punditry in the first place. Under any measure, it's a tremendous failure. Figures that I've seen recently is that the amount of cocaine produced in Colombia, despite these billions of dollars the United States has spent, despite the end of well, not end of, but the diminution of the Civil War context over some recent frame of years, I don't know if it's 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, Colombian cocaine production has tripled. Despite all this money that's spent, despite all of this corruption, despite all of this destruction that it has led to. So the drug war has been a spectacular failure. It seems thus far that Petro wants to make the changes that he can make within his country. But what's interesting to point out is just how limited the changes he can make are within his country. Arguably a useful policy tool that the Colombians have used since the 1980s is a facilitated, a sped up process of extradition to the United States for drug suspects. So it was clear, perhaps you've watched the television show Narcos, it was clear that being arrested by the Colombian state was not really a threat to the narcotics traffickers of the 1980s and 1990s, because these systems were so infiltrated by corruption that these drug moguls could continue to operate their empires from prison and live in this sort of state of luxury within prison. It's the extradition to the United States that provided a real fear for Colombian drug lords. What's interesting is now that things have calmed down a bit, Petro is proposing, as an effort to deal with narcos on a new level, on a level that might plausibly be successful, he's trying to sort out new rules around extradition, telling these drug lords that, hey, look, if you deal with us in an appropriate manner, if you help divulge your routes, if you help us shut down your business, then we'll let you stay in Colombia and get a reduced sentence at presumably a Colombian prison that's still pretty, still no longer quite so airtight, and will allow folks to have a higher standard of living. The United States is objecting to this, and I think that's a really interesting aspect of this extradition treaty that sort of highlights a problem for Colombia more broadly and for Gustavo Petro specifically. I think it's probably true that the extradition treaty between Colombia and the United States served a purpose. And even for Petro, he's saying, if you negotiate with me in good faith, I'll block your extradition to the United States. But if you don't, or if you go back on one of our negotiations, then boom, you're automatically still extradited to the United States. So even Petro acknowledges that this extradition tool is a positive thing, is something that is useful to the Colombian government for getting drug lords in line. However, it's very interesting that the U.S. government is in a position where they can simply say no, which is something that's worth unpacking a little bit. The Colombian president wants to change his policy of extraditing criminals in Colombia to the United States for trial, and the U.S. government is in a position where it can simply say no. Petro is taking the position that he wants to renegotiate this with the United States, and that's, I think, an indication of just how far Colombia's politicians prior to Petro have allowed themselves to be interweaved with the U.S. system. That's a serious sovereignty issue. Admittedly, the Colombian government put themselves into this position because things were so bad, but the fact that Colombia has to ask for permission to extricate itself from this humiliating position to a small degree. Again, Petro doesn't want to get rid of U.S. extradition of drug criminals to the United States. He just wants to allow the Colombian government to have a little more control. There's some indication, I was reading a bit this morning, I don't know if this is a fair characterization of what's been happening, but under Duque, the president prior to Petro, who just left office, there's apparently multiple instances where the U.S. government, with or without the participation of Duque himself, who's elected on a platform of being hostile to peace, the U.S. government, this extradition treaty, acted in a way to sabotage peace negotiations between the government and left-wing guerrillas, between the government and right-wing militias that also do a lot of drug trafficking. There's a wide array of ways that this extradition treaty is dramatically screwing up U.S. and is dramatically screwing up internal Colombian politics, internal Colombian peace efforts, internal Colombian negotiations around crime, justice, reconciliation, what have you. And it's pretty crazy that Petro, this crazy left-wing, the Florida politicians are calling him a narco-terrorist already, has to go hat in hand to the U.S. government to ask for revisions to an extradition treaty, and that's pretty screwed up. I mean, it's an indicator of just how limited Petro is going to be and what he's going to be able to do. He's going to be limited by the structures of government and legality that are already in place. He's going to be limited by the mandate that he's been given. He's been given a mandate for positive change. He's not been given a mandate to declare independence from the United States. He's not been given a mandate to end the global drug war. He's not been given a mandate to necessarily jump in on all the left-wing dissident government's solidarity train. He's been given a mandate to improve the economic conditions in Colombia. And it's going to be interesting. So those two factors, U.S. hooks that are just in the politics, law, and economy of Colombia, and the limits of his mandate constrain what Petro is going to be able to do. Regardless, I think what Petro is doing is tremendously exciting. And if he does manage to yield some economic benefits for the majority of Colombian voters, then there's a distinct possibility for real positive change. It's not going to be immediate. I think that he's already, in his first month in power, been taking some serious steps towards some of that economic change and economic justice. Colombia is a country that has been very U.S. affiliated, very right wing in its government. The divergence has been between center right and extreme right. So it's got a very free business class that wants to. It was a fascinating Economist article on Colombia recently that was lamenting the fact that Duque had gotten kicked out of power because it was talking about how really over the past 20 years, Colombia has been a tremendous economic success story. But then if you actually looked at Duque's time in power, or even the past decade, not looking at the 2000s anymore, really the post-financial crisis era, the Colombian economic performance has not been that impressive. I've been talking a lot about on the channel about how Reaganite creative destruction, letting business people go free, only works to a certain extent. And it now seems that Petro, for the first time, something that has not been tried in Colombia since, I don't know, the New Deal era. I'm not too straight on Colombian 20th century history, and I want to get into it. But it seems like Petro is taking real steps towards redistribution. This is with the wealth tax that he's introduced this month, and I believe some other taxes around petroleum wealth, whatnot, he has introduced. And what was interesting is I believe it is seen as, this is according to The Guardian, as likely to pass the Colombian legislature. So who knows? It's entirely possible. I tend to think it is possible. You can throw certain things at an economy. You can do redistribution. You can do let's set businesses free to invest and go crazy. And I think if you do too much of either, you're in trouble. I think that's very true. I think that one of the problems in the United States over the past 40 years is that we've done way too much of the let business free. And it's been good. It's built a lot of wealth. Now it's time to redistribute a little bit of that wealth. And it's very easy, and exactly, I think I would argue perhaps essential for the health of any government, to alternate periods where we let business go crazy with periods where the wealth generated is redistributed. We're seeing the Biden administration take just the smallest of smallest baby steps towards a little bit of redistribution recently. I think that's a good thing. The Petro administration, if this full tax passage passes the Colombian legislature, is making a huge step towards that. And if some of that redistribution benefits voters, then we would conceivably see a happier, more stable Colombia that would be capable of making more pro-peace, pro-independence decisions. I don't know, man. It's a tremendously complicated question. I feel that I have neglected to mention thus far that it's not just the drug trafficking that has made Colombia so unstable and has given such a happy feeding ground for semi-authoritarian right-wing presidents. It's also a real civil war. There is a very serious civil war in Colombia that has been going on since the 1960s, and it's not just the CIA that made that nasty. It is also left-wing guerrillas. And I think there is a lot of anger, as we saw in Duque being elected in 2018. There is a lot of anger, righteous anger, in the Colombian public towards these left-wing guerrilla types. And so it's not just the drug war that warps Colombian politics. It's also the questions of peace and war going back to 1964. So it's tremendously complicated, tremendously complex. On this war, Petro is taking more steps towards peace, which he may or may not have a mandate for. He's apparently stopped aerial bombing of militia groups, is interested in negotiation, I believe, with a wide range of actors, not just the narco traffickers, but also the right and left-wing militias that are continuing to fight. Of course, most of the right and left-wing militias are also drug traffickers. So it's tremendously complicated, it's tremendously difficult, but I do think it is, unlike the other two things we're about to discuss, I do believe it is a somewhat, not peaceful, it is a somewhat hopeful process that is happening in Colombia. It's kind of interesting is that even if Petro turns out to be phenomenally left-wing, just crazy, crazy left-wing, I think it's interesting, this is an opportunity the United States will not grasp, will not understand, is that it's actually kind of a legitimation of U.S. policy in Colombia. By no means a full legitimation. There's great horrors we'll always be guilty of. But if through those horrors we manage to shepherd through a Colombian system that still exists and can actually be used to finally finish the Civil War. I mean, in any Civil War context, if we're maintaining a representative government, the goal eventually is for all elements within that country to be incorporated in that representative government, whether it's through bribery, whether it's through what. And I think Petro, with the left-wing elements of the decisions that he is making, combined with, in his first month, who knows, this sort of rational restraint that he's also been indicating, this could be actually seen as a culmination and like something that made all of this bloodshed and disgust and horror somewhat worthwhile. If we see Petro actually stabilizing and bringing peace to Colombia and bringing a measure of economic justice, and then, 4 to 8 years from now, will be replaced by a right-leaning government because people are a little angry about how far they've gone in the other direction. That would be ideal. That would be normal politics in Colombia, not Civil War politics in Colombia. So I think if there are people in Washington, D.C. with the maturity and historical consciousness to recognize that, then even a very left-wing Petro administration could be seen as something of a vindication for U.S. involvement in keeping this Colombian government going for the past 60, 70 years. I don't expect anybody in Washington, D.C. to have that historical consciousness or broadness of mind to see that. But I thought that was worth mentioning. Okay, that's what I have to say about Colombia. Let's go to Iraq. Yesterday was a tremendously scary day in Iraq. I went to bed thinking, oh crap, Iraq's about to fall into civil war. I don't think we are there yet. This is a lot harder to construe in a hopeful fashion, which is a shame because I think the results of the election in the fall in October of 2021 were hopeful, could be seen as hopeful. Iraqi politics are fascinating. The United States government recently assassinated a Iranian general, completely illegally, risking another $1 trillion war with Iran. This is during the Trump administration, justified in part because that general, Qasem Soleimani, had been acting to help Iraq defend itself from the invasion of U.S. troops and had killed U.S. soldiers. That was part of the defense. Of course, Soleimani was primarily working at that point, through Muqtada al-Sadr, the leader of the Sadr army in Baghdad. This is the Iraqi guy who was directly working with Iran to kill U.S. soldiers during the U.S. occupation from 2003 until 2011 or so. So you'd think if we killed Soleimani, we'd want to kill Sadr as well, but that is not the case because Sadr is now just as angry at Iranian intervention in Iraq as he was at U.S. intervention. So Sadr is now, to a degree, more the Gulf's guy than he is the U.S.'s guy, because I'm sure he still opposes the U.S., the vestigial U.S. presence in Iraq. But we're not so interested in killing him because he is seen as useful to anti-Iran politics. To be clear, on this channel, I'm pretty sympathetic to Iran's choices in Yemen, in Syria. I am not sympathetic to Iran's choices in Iraq. I understand that they're doing this for self-defense purposes, but there are real-ish elections in Iraq, and Iran is doing what it can to suborn those elections. And after saving Iraq from the Islamic State, a guerrilla group largely created, supported, and funded by the United States and its allies until the United States decided to turn against it, Iran largely saved Iraq from the Islamic State through the medium of these PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces. My poor. I do usually do TikTok for a while until it stops when my phone overheats. I might need a new cell phone. What was I saying? So the Popular Mobilization Forces, the militias that Iran helped to create to defeat the Islamic State, or rather blunt the Islamic State's rampage towards Baghdad and stop it, are now, I think, indisputably a malign influence in Iraqi politics. They are armed, they are allied with political forces that are closely aligned with Iran, and they are destructive. I think it's the Coordination Network, which is, of course, a political grouping that is, to some degree, distinct from the Iran-supported Iraqi militias, but these are all relationships that can shift, is apparently still pushing the career of Maliki, the disastrous Iraqi prime minister in the era leading up to the Islamic State near conquest of the country. Sadr has positioned himself against them. In the elections in October 2021, Sadr's forces won the balance of, I think, was it the majority of the Shia votes? And it looked like if Sadr was able to make some sort of deal with the Sunni and Kurdish forces in Iraq, he would have been able to form an actual government with an agenda to fix things in opposition to the Iran-supported forces. This was rightly not just by U.S. anti-Iran forces, but by many other forces who were interested in Iraq having real politics and real stability. This was celebrated. This was real potential. Iraq, prior to the 2021 elections, when was the first Iraqi elections? 2003, 2004, has always been governed by a coalition of all the political parties and representing the sectarian divides within Iraq: Kurdish, Shia, Sunni. This mess of coalition governments has failed utterly in providing any kind of decent services to Iraq. Iraq is a massive oil and gas producer. That money has largely been stolen. It is a massive oil and gas producer that is incapable of keeping the air conditioners running in Baghdad over these obscenely hot summers. Baghdad, of course, being one of the warmer places on the planet. It is a spectacular failure that, of course, has its roots in the U.S. invasion, and subsequent to the U.S. invasion, the U.S. choice to destroy every aspect of Iraqi government in the name of a hyper-libertarian cult. A hyper-libertarian cult that's had some success in the United States because there's a vast, centuries-old institutional infrastructure that can be profitably destroyed and played with, and in some cases even positively reformed by libertarian deregulatory actions. If you just take the libertarian fundamentalism and install it in a country with a free rein to destroy everything that came before it, what you're going to get is destruction. So what we've seen in Iraq for the past 2 decades now is a nominally democratic coalition government motivated under a constitutional structure and motivated by an ideology of every man for himself. The greed and corruption, the legendary greed and corruption of this class of broadly disgusting Iraqi politicians is largely endorsed and supported and fostered by the constitutional structure that was left behind by delusional U.S. libertarian fundamentalists like Paul Bremer and the rest of the Bush administration. So it's a really, really, really shitty situation. And with the October 2021 election, it seemed like we would move beyond these broad sectarian coalitions united by nothing other than an urge to rob the Iraqi public blind. We were going to move beyond that into a world where Iraq might have real politics. Sadr would be able to put together a real coalition with a real platform beyond sectarian unity and sectarian unified robbery to something that could actually build positive change in Iraq. That has not happened. These elections were in October 2021. We are now in August 2022. Sadr has failed to make things work. He's negotiated, he's tried, he's failed to make things work with Kurd and Sunni parties to form a government. He has failed to negotiate, bribe, cajole, threaten other aspects, other Shia parties into uniting in a sort of somewhat anti-Iranian coalition. And what we've seen over the past months is an escalating series of choices by Sadr and other elements within the Iraqi politics that have led to, last night, serious open warfare between Shia elements in Baghdad. I think we'd already seen the Iraqi parliament occupied by Sadrist forces in an attempt to push a new election, perhaps. I could be wrong on the details there. Last night we saw Sadrist forces occupy a large portion of the Green Zone. The traditional model in Iraq, what we've seen a lot of, is Iraqi government forces, usually affiliated to some degree with this sort of PMF coordination front, Iranian-aligned approach, deal with massive protests from Sadrists and others, extraordinarily violently. What happened yesterday was after Muqtada al-Sadr announced his retirement, his complete retirement from political activities, we saw a lot of those protesters show up armed. After I believe a couple dozen of them were killed, they came back with weapons, and we had open warfare in the Green Zone, the area that was built by U.S. occupiers and is now the seat of the Iraqi government, such as it is. There were interesting footage of protesters taking advantage of the pool in the presidential palace or what have you. It's all been rather scary, frankly, and last night it looked very possible that Iraq would fall back into serious civil war, this time not along sectarian lines, Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, but intra-Shia war. Looked like a real possibility. Sadr, I think, quite arguably, quite possibly, resigned yesterday, announced his retirement yesterday in an effort to sort of show everybody how much worse things would be without him. This morning, I think it's also arguable, or perhaps it's all theater, but it's arguable that he was a little taken aback by the scale of violence and destruction led about by this. I think he initially announced he'd do a hunger strike until it was over, and then he just outright ordered his followers to abandon the Green Zone. Yeah, I don't know, man. I think things look calmer this morning than they did last night. It seems as though open civil war has been averted for today in Iraq, but what does that mean long term? What potential is there for serious resolution of any of Iraq's problems? We've gone here once, we can go there again. What was another scary thing about last night was that the violence wasn't just in Baghdad, it spread beyond Baghdad as well. I saw the city's names escape me, but there was violence in other places in the city, in the country. We seem to have come back from the brink this morning, but again, it's hard to be excited or optimistic about Iraq. We'll see if the political machinations have been changed. We'll see if the coordination framework backs off a little bit. We'll see if there's another election in Iraq. But it's hard to be super optimistic. That's what I've got to say about Iraq. And now moving on to Ethiopia, about which I have nothing positive to say. We had arrived at this very delicate and unpleasant status quo. We had, in November of 2020, we had a very confident Ethiopian government announce that it was going to crush the Tigrayan region, the Tigrayans that had run the country for a period of almost 30 years, I believe, prior to Abiy Ahmed's rise to power. He was the Ethiopian prime minister, right? Um, he very confidently announced in November that he was going to go in and crush the Tigrayans. The details of the launching of that conflict are kind of chicken and the egg. A lot of the news we get out of Ethiopia, despite how horrific this conflict is, almost certainly, well, I don't know about almost certainly, but very possibly hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, but we pay very little attention to it because both the Ethiopians and the Tigrayans are pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? Dishonest? Well, they certainly like to trend things in their direction, so it's impossible to really tell what's going on there. Conflict started November of 2020. In, I believe, the spring or summer of 2021, I believe, just about a year or so ago. No, in June of 2021, the complete failure of the Ethiopian government's attempt to crush Tigray became manifest and apparent. In straight up open warfare, the Ethiopians lost large numbers of their, I think, divisions of their military were lost. I mean, it's like Dien Bien Phu's style type stuff. True, massive, upfront, straight up military losses by the Ethiopian government. Then the Tigrayans started marching on the capital, and way too many overly credulous Western commentators, myself included, in a short or two before I corrected myself, were talking about the Tigrayans conquering the country. That is not something that is likely. This minority of 6 or 7% of the country is simply, no matter how much better connected or more wealthy or more experienced in military affairs they are not going to be able to conquer a country filled with other proud ethnicities. I just don't see it as possible. They attempted this last summer, fall, and eventually were turned back because of massive support for the Ethiopian government by Turkey, the UAE, and Iran to an extent. I think approved by the US government, not the Iran bit, but the Turkey and the UAE bit. So we had a nasty status quo throughout the course of this year where the Tigrayans were still, to some degree, being blockaded by the Ethiopian government, but large-scale fighting was not going on. There was a lot of talk about African Union mediation, other mediations, peace talks, real steps forward. And at some point towards the end of last week, that progress failed. I've seen some interpretations that actually this might have something to do with the Kenyan elections. The Tigrayans are now no longer interested in the mediation of the former Nigerian president. Is it Obasanjo? Apologies for the mispronunciation. They see him as unfairly biased towards Abiy Ahmed. They may feel that way about the African Union in general, which I think is a very understandable bias towards national unity. So it seemed like there was a Kenyan politician who may intervene and be acceptable to both parties and have a more positive diplomatic effect. But the recent Kenyan elections may have unseated that politician or done something to his power that makes that seem less likely. So that might have been the inciting action for a long, long overdue re-outbreak of serious, serious hostilities. Again, we get into chicken and the egg, unreliable reporting here, whether it seems likely to me that the Tigrayans would have kicked this off, but it seems clear that whether it was before this kicked off or after this kicked off, the Ethiopian government carried out a particularly horrific bombing run on Mekele, the Tigrayan capital, supposedly killed a bunch of kindergartners. And it seems like, again, this is all up in the air, we don't know. It seems like in recent days, the Tigrayans have again managed to achieve pretty quick, staggering victories against Ethiopian government forces. Who's to say maybe this time this will lead to some kind of fall in Abiy Ahmed's power? It's quite possible. Could fall from power, but it's just as likely that the renewed threat of the Tigrayans, the old much hated owners of of Ethiopia prior to Abiy Ahmed, this could actually shore up his support, as it certainly did last year. Who knows? It's impossible to predict what's going to happen, but I think it is very possible to say that the ceasefire that had survived, and to be clear, this was always a very tenuous ceasefire. Ongoing low-level skirmishing was absolutely happening. Their bombing was absolutely happening. But I think it's fair to say at this point that we've now gone beyond the scale of what was occurring at that point. So yeah, things are grim in Ethiopia and getting grimmer. I will keep trying to stay on top of this on Twitter. And yeah, there we go. Okay, so I think now this ends the presentation part of my presentation. So now we're doing Q&A for the next hour and 10 minutes. We will be answering I will be answering whatever questions you have. So yeah, I am of course more likely to I will respond to every question that comes with a super chat. Super chat is a key part of the revenue of this channel that keeps it going, as rinky-dink as that may seem. But typically I get $100 or so from these live chats through the super chats. We have had no super chats yet, so I'd like some super chats. That'd be great. Of course, grateful to everybody and any questions that folks may have. What about D-Man? D-Man33 asks a very, very good question. What about the Ukrainian offensive? It's a huge gosh darn deal. Loga also chimes in on thoughts on the Kherson offensive. Oh, we're at no data. Reconnection successful. Let's see. Let's see if we're back. Are we back? The OBS studio crapped out for a minute. Let me know if we're back. But I will get back to talking about... Anja Balanzar says, hope it's not like Ukraine's other offensives. I hope it really works this time. The Kherson offensive is something that has been long promised by the Ukrainian government, long threatened, and to the point where it's like, gosh, are they just going to keep threatening this and then make a move somewhere else? I've seen some indications on Twitter that might be what's happening. Supposedly Kherson is what the Ukrainian government has been saying for so far. But I've heard some indications that there's actually a huge push around, I have no idea how to pronounce this, or even Kryvyi or something like that, which is a little bit, further to the north and east, but still very much on the southern front. So it seems like there's a real push by the Ukrainian government that's actually happening this time. They need to do a big offensive. The Ukrainian government needs to do a big offensive that shows some kinds of success. Because if they don't, I think that oil and gas pressures are going to get so extreme this fall and winter that if the Ukrainian government, the US government, elements within Europe that are trying to make the case for all these sacrifices that are being made on behalf of the Ukrainians, if the Ukrainians haven't really taken any territory back since that, was it May? Since that retreat by Russia that could actually be construed as more a retreat than actually a... wow, it's a ton of super chats. I need to talk about Ukraine, but I will get to all these super chats. Thank you guys, you're very generous. I really need to answer this Ukraine question. Ukraine needs to do this. They've talked about this for way too long, to my mind. But it's also possible that Ukraine has been marshaling the necessary forces. There's been a ton of training activity that's gone on over the past 6 months. The attrition of the Ukrainian military in the east has been horrific. I think that both Russia and Ukraine put some of their best resources and soldiers into the fight over Severodonetsk, which Ukraine has lost, and the Luhansk province and the Donetsk province, which is ongoing. And both have lost a lot of their military. You know, the elite forces of both the Russian and Ukrainian military that were present in February of 2022 have to some extent been wiped out. Not wiped out entirely. I don't know what those factors are. Those are closely guarded figures that neither the Ukrainian nor Russian government wants to talk about openly. However, the Ukrainians do have a ton of money, and that money and resources, while a lot of it's going towards weapons systems that enrich U.S. executives and congresspeople, a lot of money has been going towards training. A lot of Ukrainian soldiers have been undergoing training in the United States. A lot of Ukrainian volunteers who in February essentially joined the military. So while with Russia, you've got this situation where they're progressively more and more desperately trying to get old folks to come back to the military. There's been a recent announcement, I don't fully understand the minutia of it, that Russia's going to add to the size of their military by a third, but they're probably going to have difficulty doing that. Ukraine got a tremendous rush of volunteers 6 months ago. 6 months ago, these were not soldiers. They were not folks who knew what they were doing. 6 months later, after intensive training, these are guys and gals who can fight. And I think it's entirely possible that Ukraine has been marshaling forces, getting these trained folks in part, figuring out HIMARS and other weapon systems that have been given to them. And it's entirely possible that over the next couple days, we're going to see serious movement. Because, yeah, we've been talking about Kherson offensives and, you know, the Institute for the Study of War, which is probably the most famous of the tracking the progress of the conflict, and also is probably the most explicitly of those, even more explicitly pro-Ukrainian than a lot of Ukrainian sources folks use for that. You know, it's sort of their constant happy chat about the Kherson offensive over the past 3 or 4 months now, it feels like, has seemed progressively more and more desperate. They're like, oh, look at this little blue sliver that they've captured and recaptured and they're holding, and we promise it's exciting. It's entirely possible that over the next week, we will see serious movement in Ukraine's favor. It is very slimly possible that we will see serious conflict-changing movement. Like, is there a possibility that we see demoralized Russian troops across these fronts? Yeah, sure, but it's not particularly likely. Like, maybe there's like a 1 to 5% chance, 10% chance at the outside that we see just this massive Russian collapse. I find it very unlikely. I think Russia has tremendous forces that it still can bring to bear. It'll cause them more pain or what have you. So yeah, I would say there's a 40% chance that we'll see real movement over the next week. There's probably a 60% chance that it won't, that we'll see a just dissipation of these efforts. You know, as of this morning, you know, before hopping on here, maybe we've got more news out of Ukraine that already makes what I'm saying here seem silly and negative. But, you know, they with all this announcement, this big talk, they've taken 4 villages along the front line. And that's not nothing. That's important. They're knocking out bridges. I think it would be great for Ukraine, would actually improve Ukraine's position dramatically from a diplomatic perspective for an eventual deal or what have you, if they were able to successfully even just take I believe it's the west bank of the Dnieper. So if they could just take back that chunk around Kherson and kick the Russians to the other side of the Dnieper, then I think that would be huge. That would really honestly improve the possibilities for a positive peace. It would demonstrate that the Ukrainians are capable of taking back territory. It would stiffen the resolve of the United States. It would stiffen the resolve of Europe. And I think it would make Russia more likely to just see reason and back down a little bit. Who knows? I saw ridiculous tweets saying that, oh, you know, Russia's going to start nuking people if they start losing in Ukraine, which is just such dumbass dog shit. I think you have to understand that there's an incredible lobby in the United States that's pro-nuclear, that wants us to build more and more sophisticated, literally, I think, has successfully gotten us to spend $1 trillion over the next 10 years, a mere $100 billion a year, expanding and our nuclear arsenal. And part of that is to claim that everybody else is potentially on the cusp of using nukes. Whereas really it's the United States, strikes me as the only place that has a serious lobby dedicated towards the idea of using tactical nuclear weapons, the idea that nuclear weapons are anything other than a civilization-ending mistake. That's mostly the U.S. thing. So when you see a U.S. or British person telling you, oh, well, it's just common knowledge. Russia's going to use them nukes. It's like, no, Russia's not going to fucking nuke a territory on its border. Fallout is a thing. It's just like, in the context of Russia being invaded, and in the context of, it's marginally more likely if the Ukrainian military were to start taking back Crimea. That's, who knows? And the Putin regime felt like it was about to fall. Still, 95% not a chance they actually use nuclear weapons. In the context of like losing a little bit of the territory that they took in February, no fucking way. And I think it's more an indication of the U.S. and Western eagerness to talk about the use and continue developing nuclear weapons than it is anything else. So, D-Man, I think that's what I have to say about the Ukraine offensive. I want it to be successful. I hope it will be successful. I'm not super reliant on the idea that it be successful, but I think it's possible that it be successful. We'll see. I look forward to getting off of this chat and seeing if there's actual indication that it's been successful. So D-Man33 says, thanks for all your work, man. Well, thank you. Staro Pulsaro, Super Chat. Technically speaking, Biden is left-wing as well. What would you say is the difference between Latin American left and the U.S. left? I would not call Biden left-wing. I would call Biden, he used to be known as the senator from MBNA, which I guess MBNA doesn't exist anymore, but it was essentially the senator from MasterCard. Like, that guy has no real affiliation with left. He was an avid Cold Warrior, business, as pro-business a guy as you can imagine. He was a senator from Delaware. For those of you who don't know, Delaware is the business mecca in the United States. It's a tiny state without much more than a throughway. I think in my entire life, I have met like 3 people from Delaware, and it's always exciting when I do. It's in between, I guess, New Jersey and Maryland. I've driven through it dozens of times. I once spent the night in Delaware because my car broke down in Wilmington. But it occupies a weird, inordinately powerful position in corporate America because it has the most corporate-friendly laws. So almost every corporation in the Fortune 500 in the United States has its headquarters in Delaware for legal purposes to take the benefits of Delaware laws. So regardless, a Delaware senator is going to be one of the most corrupt left-wing people you can imagine, corrupt pro-business people you can imagine, and that is exactly what Joe Biden was. What Joe Biden is, there's 2 things that make Joe Biden appear a little more left-wing. And is it even left-wing to be pro-union anymore? Like, to be pro, like, working-class people? Like, I don't know. Certainly the Republicans are at the moment, more anti-union than the Democrats are. But what he is old, and he comes from an era where the Democrats were much closer to unions, and he is still willing to talk that talk and to a small extent walk that walk in terms of being pro-union and talking about unions. And that can seem kind of left-wing, but like, where does the rubber hit the road? Like, where is the progress on things that unions have really cared about? I think in the Inflation Reduction Act, was there something about some protections for labor or minimum wage or, vague retraining stuff? No, I mean, there's all these, unions have had a political menu that they've been pushing for decades. Is card check one of them or something like that? Making it harder for right-to-work states at the federal level. These are things that Biden could easily have done, maybe not card check, but Biden could easily have done much more from an executive branch Department of Labor perspective towards like his old school left wing pro union rhetoric. I've seen precious little indication that he's done any of that. What has happened, Sarah Pulsaro, is that the Democratic Party has moved further left. This is a formulation I see a lot on Twitter, and I think makes sense. What did I most recently read? This was this somebody's Substack, but it's a commonplace. It's not, I think, directly attributable to anybody's. The point that Joe Biden is a party man. He actually believes in his political party, cares what his political party thinks. That has certainly not been the case of Donald Trump or Barack Obama. Biden does care, and the Democratic Party base has moved left. That is indisputable. I think that's a rational response, not just to Donald Trump, but like the 40 years of Reaganism and its failures. And I think not out of like real left-wing passion for himself, but actually probably in an attempt to diffuse left-wing passions. I mean, now that there's been some student loan forgiveness, I mean, that's actually a tremendous attack on the left, if you think about it. One of the greatest motivators of Democratic Socialists of America, just general left-wing agitation over the past decade, before and after Trump, has been the absurd debt peonage, sort of debt slavery that we've pushed much of the millennial generation into. I've seen indicators that like this clears out the debt of like just the 10 grand, 20 grand, clears out the debt of like, did I see 40 million people? So that's like 40 million people who feel a little more relief and a little more bought in to the U.S. political system as it exists and are a lot less interested in revolutionary solutions. So yeah, like Biden is a party man. The party has moved left, so he's willing to do more left-wing things. Like, is being anti-emissions even left-wing anymore? Like pour, $30 billion a year towards the climate, or do this relatively minor debt relief thing. So yeah, I just don't really see Biden as left-wing. But sorry, to the other part of your question, the difference between Latin American left and the U.S. left, I would say Petro is much, much more legitimately left-wing. Biden is at best center-left, essentially center-right, or just dead center. Whereas the Latin American left, Petro, even like careful, constrained, incrementalist Petro is vastly, vastly more left-wing. I mean, Petro is likely to enact a wealth tax, like a wealth tax. I think Warren talked about a wealth tax, but you're just not ever gonna see. I mean, no, things would have to get a lot worse. Like if we had like another 15 years of Republican governance and tax cuts and like deregulatory nightmares and continued decay of everything, then yes, as 40 years of Reaganism made Bernie Sanders viable as a candidate, but not a winning candidate. If we had another, 10, 15 years of old school Republican governance that made things worse and worse and worse, then the incredible reaction, then we'd get a Bernie Sanders style president who would conceivably be able to do a wealth tax. But the fact that it seems likely that Colombia is going to have a wealth tax by the end of the year. That's much, much more left-wing. And that's sort of just the realm of the possible. Things are more possible in systems where things are worse. The level of inequality in Latin America is immense. There were periods in the 2000s where you had a lot of left-wing governments and even some right-wing governments who were willing to do more redistribution, also in the context of an incredible run-up in resource costs. And many of these countries were resource exporters. The Bolivian economic miracle, the Brazilian, I don't think we really talk about, no, there was serious economic progress in Brazil. Under Lula, these things were made possible by tremendous rise in the prices of commodities that Bolivia and Brazil sold. The failure of Venezuela, the abject failure of Venezuela in the face of that, is another indictment of Chavez and Maduro. But generally, things have been getting worse in Latin America. I don't know if there's much positive economic news out of Latin America to point to since 2008, and certainly since the taper tantrum in 2013. I don't think there's anything positive to point to. Things just got worse. So even in Colombia, traditionally much more right-leaning pro-business country, a wealth tax became possible. So things would have to get much worse in the United States for something like that to become possible. And Biden's choice to alleviate, I mean, that's totally tomorrow's short, how Biden's student debt relief is the most anti-socialist thing possible. If Democratic governments and Republican governments, I think there's a real possibility that Trump highlighted that Republican governments might be interested in some positive redistributive change as well. If those governments manage to make those minor changes at the margin, like student debt relief, maybe a child tax credit, stuff like that, some reduction in healthcare costs, some reduction in housing costs. If the U.S. government can continue to make that, then things will never get bad enough for a much more serious left wing to come to power. That's just sort of how I see politics. I hope that was helpful, Star Posaro. Man, I think we have a lot of super chats to catch up on. Christopher Murtaugh, do you think there is enough political will to end the war on drugs / other countries policy in the U.S.? Despite it being an obvious failure, it doesn't get mentioned at all in day-to-day political discourse. That's true, man. Like, it's just like everything else. Donald Trump sucked all wind out of this. Like, I think there was real movement in like the 2010, 2016. I mean, obviously, I'm roping in other things, but real movement towards criminal justice reform in the United States. War on drugs, of course, in its foreign policy context, is a very different thing, Christopher. But they are connected. And I think there was real movement towards acknowledging the failures of the war on drugs, decriminalization. I mean, we see it at the local level. I mean, the New York has changed dramatically. New York City has changed dramatically. From what it was like when I was a kid, and in my 20s, I had multiple friends arrested for marijuana use. You know, they'd smoke a joint on the street and spend the night in jail. My friends were generally sort of affluent white folks, so they'd get out fairly quickly, and it would be a slap on the wrist. But you know, that was the world that existed. When I got back to New York in 2018, everybody smokes marijuana all the time, everywhere. And really, only this year, I think, full legalization has happened in New York. So there's just pot everywhere. So like things are still moving, but the high level, let's get the federal government involved. What can we change? How do we reform prosecutorial stuff? I can't recall big movements internationally. I know that AMLO talked about it. I know that Evo Morales talked about it. I know that now Gustavo Petro talked about it. But I don't know, even in the United States, where there's real interest in criminal justice reform and real interest in decriminalization or even legalization of marijuana, seen very little mention of how that would trickle down to our policies, to our tremendously, in some senses, dictatorial policies towards the rest of Latin America and what they can and cannot do. I feel like every 3 or 4 years, there's some international movement, be it a UN convention, be it something that some leader has convened, talking about how desperately we need a different international drug policy. And I'm sure there's enough people in the United States, you know, who nod their heads along and say, yeah, that's totally true. Let's move on to something else. I have not seen any real movement towards that. The Biden administration, their comments on Petro's extremely incremental and minor moves towards shifts have been uniformly negative. And it's really interesting the way that, you know, okay, yeah, this is bad. This has killed hundreds of thousands of people, costs billions of dollars, and has not limited the drug market in any substantive way anywhere in the world. But the alternative could be worse. Sadly, those kinds of arguments get pretty far. I don't see a lot of political will. But also, I don't see a ton of this is important. I also don't see a ton of political will within the United States to maintain it. I think most people, most political folks recognize that it's been a terrible, terrible failure. And the question is, in the 80s, okay, that overstates it. But is the national security state, the U.S., willing to kill Petro over drug decriminalization? I don't think so anymore. The problem, of course, is that the individual members of the national security state whose jobs and budgets depend on that Colombia-U.S. Anti-drug relationship, yeah, maybe some of them might be willing to kill Petro. Certainly in cooperation with Colombian right-wing forces that would like to see him dead anyway. So it's a very grim digression. The question is, though, if there really was a multinational effort from South America, they all sort of got together and said, no, we're done. We're done. We're decriminalizing this. The DEA is courteously invited to get the fuck out. We need to figure out a different approach. Would there be a groundswell of negativity in the United States against that? I don't think so. Whereas, trying to get the United States out of the Middle East, there is a legitimate, yes, of course, to some extent lobbied or whatever, but there would be a legitimate, oh, but what about Israel? We gotta, there'd be a legitimate, groundswell against that sort of thing, because we need to protect Israel or whatever. I don't think a broad-based shift in U.S. drug policy would make anybody angry in the United States other than the law enforcement professionals whose jobs depend on that international war on drugs, other countries. So, yeah, I don't know. And the problem, of course, is that the Border Patrol, which has become immensely powerful, been given, it seems like they're given $10 billion new dollars every year by Democratic and Republican administrations since Clinton. They have become massively, massively more powerful in U.S. politics. And they're a tremendous force for the status quo in the drug war. So while I don't think there's any legitimate democratic political will against a saner drug policy, I think that a new and powerful and violent and disgusting player in U.S. politics, heavily funded by the U.S. government, the U.S. Border Patrol and related agencies, has an interest in keeping things the way they are. And that's the real obstacle, I think. Jack Hawkins, $5 super chat. Turkey's growing position as an independent player on the global stage, even as its currency collapses. Do you see a plan? Do I see a plan on the behalf of the Turkish government? Do I see a plan, by the Faiz lobby, the interest rate lobby, to crush Turkish aspirations? I don't see either of those. What I do see is Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the former prime minister, now president of Turkey, as unquestionably the second most significant figure in the history of the Turkish Republic, after Ataturk himself. He is a guy who's had tremendous positive influence on Turkey and certainly the balance of his influence over the past decade has been a tremendously negative influence on Turkish politics. And I think the main plan, the main discernible actor, the main discernible force in Turkish politics and Turkey's regional politics is Erdogan. And Erdogan's drive for self-perpetuation, Erdogan's drive to stay in power. So that's the main plan. That's the main actor. He's hyperactive. He's constantly doing things. He's constantly trying to find an angle, develop a new stratagem, and his throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, as infuriating as it was when I lived there, and as frustrating as it is watching it from abroad. It's worked, tremendous failures, tremendous economic failure, the condemnation and mocking of the entire economic establishment in the world, with his unorthodox views on interest rates and what have you. But, you know, he's still there. And we're coming up next year, guaranteed elections in Turkey. And the hope, in many cases, the expectation is that he will lose power. But nothing's guaranteed here. Um, he could pull it off. I've seen some indicators, I haven't looked into it this week, that he's actually managed to um, bring back a modicum of economic growth to Turkey. Whether that makes enough difference for folks who've watched their currency be almost entirely devalued over the past couple of years, I don't know, man. I don't know. I would love to see Erdogan get his ass kicked next year in the elections. Um, I wish I could say I was super confident. I still think that's the more likely result, but I'm not super confident that that's the result. So yeah, Erdogan's got plans and plans and plans and plans. It's chaotic execution. It's a bit random, but it's worked. Dude's been in power in a system with multiple fair elections for fucking 20 years now. Almost 20 years now. Yeah. Let's see. James Parker, enjoy your week. Well, thank you, James Parker. That's very kind. Do you have any questions? Let's see. Fado, from Iran's perspective, keeping Iraq weak is vital. A powerful Iraq is viewed as a huge threat to their interests, and Iran remembers the Iran-Iraq War. Yeah, I mean, I get that. Like, I can see, certainly, Iran is not paranoid. Iran has many, 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 many reasons to fear and want to get out in front of U.S. intervention, other interventions, and of course, Iraq specifically has been the source of incredible violence done to Iran. Was it a million men, women, and children, or just 500,000 men, women, and children that died in Iraq's attack on Iran in the 1980s? Yeah, the Iranian perspective is of course always worth incorporating, but what they're doing in Iraq is very different from what they're doing in Syria, where they are shoring up crappy but legitimate government, or in Yemen, where they are helping indigenous actors defend against an invasion. There have been points in Iranian involvement in Iraq where they have been defending against a U.S. invasion, then defending against the Islamic invasion, which was also just a U.S. invasion by proxy, even though the U.S. was occasionally bombing that proxy. It's not occasionally, making an extraordinary amount of money bombing that proxy. But what Iran is doing in Iraq now is no longer supportive. It is undermining. It is making Iraq weaker. And yes, that's, I totally take your point, Fadal, that's certainly might be what they want to do, but it's not, in many cases, I believe Iran is a force for good in the Middle East. In Iraq, they are a force for evil. And that isn't changed by the fact that they helped save the country back in 2014. 8 years later, they are now making the country weaker and increasing the possibility. Demon 3 says, whoa, already debt forgiveness. Reform preventing revolution is a sensible thing. And that's exactly, I think, what we're going to see in the United States over the next decade, whether it's under Democrats or Republicans. There's, I think, an acknowledgement that we've reached a point of extreme inequality, not just in the aggregate figures, but in terms of, health, education, and health, education, and what's the word I'm looking for? Health, education, and housing just only being available to the top 20% of the people in the country, and that's simply not. That has to change. It'll change over the next decade, peacefully and carefully within the context of the U.S. two-party system, or it'll change 30 years from now in a revolution. Or maybe it'll change with bigger reforms in the 2030s. I don't know. Not a revolution. So yeah. See here. Star Pulsar, what are your thoughts on NEOM and the other Saudi project to diversify away from oil? I should talk more about this. I'm sort of been frustrating watching Adam something get like hundreds of thousands of views, essentially making videos with views that I made 8 years ago, or not 8 years, which is it's 2017, 5 years ago. If you want to see me talk at length about how guaranteed, just watch some of my, yeah, if you just click on most watched videos, I've got a video called Saudi Arabia is Finished, and that talks about how Vision 2030 is doomed to failure. I think at some point in the Everybody's Lying About Islam series, I talk about what a joke NEOM is. Yeah, like, so Saudi Arabia's been doing this for 70 years now. There's a King Abdullah technical city, or IT city, or technology city that, and it's not that these projects don't get built. They get built to an extent. It's just that they're never anywhere near on the scale that they're supposed to be. Like King Abdullah Technical City is like it's been around for 20 years, and I think there's a university there. Maybe it does good work. I don't know. That it's got a tenth or a 20th or a 100th of the population of what the initial promotional materials put out there. And I think NEOM is going to be very similar. There's already people living there. There's already people trying to build it. There's been recent, I think the Wall Street Journal definitely, and I think maybe the New York Times as well, did recent long reads on just what a joke NEOM is and how it's all just sort of smoke and mirrors. The line, it's just this incredible architectural, architecturally complex plans. It's just none of that is going to come to fruition to the same degrees. Like the line is supposed to be this 150-mile long wall / building or something. Maybe they'll build half a mile of it. Maybe they'll build 2 miles of it. The problem is, and this is an open question. I think I know the answer to it, but it is an open question whether what has made all of these prior projects such a joke is that they're all based to some degree on the idea that they're going to prompt a flood of outside investment. So Saudi Arabia is going to take these choices, going to build this city that's a little bit different, maybe has laws that are a little bit different, and there's going to be a flood of outside investment that's going to come pouring in. That's sort of always been and that's always faltered because who the fuck wants to invest in Saudi Arabia prior to 2016? Like, what, we're going to send people to work there, and like women have to stay inside wearing all black, and it's the only thing you can do for entertainment is go to malls with dudes. So I think it is an open question whether MBS's reforms are going to make this idea that, okay, we build some crazy city and then outside investors pour in. Is this going to make it more viable? I think it's a thesis that's arguable. That, well, MBS has, up until MBS, there was a literal police force that was encouraged to go around punching people who weren't, who tried to talk to women or weren't wearing appropriate dress or this, that, and the other thing. Saudi Arabia, to be clear, still has a very high degree of socially enforced intolerance for women and whatnot, but they have made, under MBS, this is sometimes ignored because of such an unappealing figure that MBS is, but he absolutely has. The Saudi Crown Prince, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, absolutely has made sweeping reforms, not to the extent of a European or American country, but he has dramatically liberalized the lives of young people, the lives of women in Saudi Arabia, the ability of women to work. So there's a possibility that, well, the question is, has he opened things enough that outside investment might actually be interested in building things in these dream utopia cities that Saudi Arabian kings love to build? I would argue probably not, and that his reputation for killing people, his nasty positioning in international conflicts, has, in practice, for the past 5 years or so, made that investment not materialize. Like NEOM is forecast to cost $500 billion, right? That $500 billion is not, emphatically not, coming from the Saudi government. I think the Saudi government does, in a given year, have hundreds of billions of dollars to play around with from Aramco because of oil and gas profits. But those hundreds of billions of dollars a year have to fund every other project, and also all the social spending that keeps everyone from killing the Saudi royal family, and also the Saudi royal family, and also everything about the government there. So yeah, NEOM is not going to end up being what is promised, but could it end up being more of a thing than prior utopian cities? It's possible. I still think Saudi Arabia, as a concern, I think Saudi Arabia is done by 2030. I still think that's the case. So I don't expect NEOM to become a thing, but I suppose anything's possible. It is certainly not going to become a thing on the level of its promotional materials, though. Daxton Min, very out of place question, but what are your thoughts on Fidel Castro and his legacy in Cuba? Thoughts on Cuba in general, too. Daxton Min, that is a very out of left field question, and I also have no answer to it. I have not researched Cuba much at any point. My understanding is that, just broad strokes, a strong reaction to U.S. abuse of Cuba through dictators like Batista and other reasons, the fact that we still maintain a military base on Cuba, despite 60 years of outright hostility to it. Like, I am sympathetic to the Cuban communists on that level. Some rebellion was very necessary. But I have not really investigated it to a great extent. Is the degree of authoritarian control that is maintained in Cuba, is it necessary to survive, arguably? Is it bad for human beings? Also, arguably, I just don't know. I've not done any in-depth research in Cuba. My position is that we should absolutely open up to Cuba, end all embargoes, encourage all trade relations, because that, of course, would be the quickest way to collapse their communist government. I don't know. PI the Base says, mega projects are 90% of the time just a huge waste of money. Yep. Thoughts on West Papua? No, unfortunately. My understanding is there's some Indonesian military folks killed some West Papuans, West Papua being the easternmost one of the easternmost provinces in Indonesia, and the chances of separatism there are not to be sneezed at. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have any special knowledge about that. Fadel says Gulf diversification is a scam. None of them have come close to achieving the level of economic diversification that Iraq achieved under the Baathists. Yep. I think that's true. All the Saudi Arabia in particular is just littered with the skeletons of diversification efforts past. I actually had a friend who was doing some consulting work in Saudi Arabia, and I believe on one of the earlier, I think one of King Abdallah's utopian projects, and he was pretty appalled. He didn't say it was a worthless effort, but he hated being in Saudi Arabia, and was not impressed with really anything there. Logo Cool Extreme asks, what happened to all the Kemalists in Turkey? How come they're not opposing Erdogan? There are a lot of Kemalists opposing Erdogan, but Kemalism, does it shade into nationalism? Does it, that was part of the really effective switch that Erdogan made in 2015. The Kemalism is, of course, a wide-ranging thing. Is a Kemalist, is it a Western-educated, female attorney who likes to share posts of Ataturk and votes for the JHP, or is it a hardcore nationalist walking through the streets looking for Kurds to beat up? Both of those can be described as Kemalism. So it's sort of You can describe Erdogan to some extent as Kemalist, to the extent that Turkish politics and organization is. This is, of course, an over extreme example, but Erdogan is forced on public occasions to pay homage to Ataturk. Is that Kemalist? So Kemalism is a very shaky, shady thing, but there's absolutely a large core of pro-secular, pro-Western folks in Turkey who cherish the memory of Ataturk. Those are Kemalists, and they are largely opposed to Turkey. Sorry, largely opposed to Erdogan. But there are also a lot of other people in Turkey that, predominantly poorer people, more rural people, that Erdogan brought into the process that have a more ambiguous relationship. I think all Turks, to a degree, revere Ataturk, but have a more ambiguous relationship towards the instincts you're just probably thinking of as Kemalism. Over the course of Erdogan's time in power, he has co-opted different elements. Have to remember that up until 2010 or so, one of the greatest challenges and threats, far surpassing, in some people's minds, far surpassing Erdogan and the AK Party, was the military. The military that had crushed democracy in Turkey over and over and over again, most recently in 1997. So before 2010, you had a lot of Turkish liberals, Turkish folks who were against military control, and certainly for economic liberalization. Even if they didn't like the AK Party's Muslim influence, they sort of held their nose and went for the AK Party because the AK Party was an effective opponent of military power in Turkey and a very effective pro-business element. Those elements, of course, have been lost since 2010 and, of course, 2013. And sort of rejoined the JHP. But during the Erdogan's earlier times in power, hyper-nationalists really hated him. This is a different part of the group of people that could be described as Kemalist. Hyper-nationalist folks hated Erdogan because he was, in part, some of them, because he was more religious. He was accurately perceived as being less respectful towards Ataturk, not openly, but you could read between the lines. So a lot of hyper-nationalists really hated him, and because he was more open to peace with the, did I mention that already? He was more open to peace with the Kurds. After 2015, when the AK Party lost its first election, it looked like it would lose its minority, in part to a Kurdish party, then Erdogan took a hard shift towards hyper-nationalism and got all of those old-school Kemalist hyper-nationalists that disliked him throughout the 2000s, got them on his side by killing Kurds and fighting Kurds. So yeah, Erdogan has just done a really good job of negotiating around and navigating around Turkish politics for quite some time. All right, no more super chats. Let's see, questions. The AK Party is off. The AK Party is also affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, yes. Thoughts on Equatorial Guinea? No. Darahuhu, I'm afraid I do not have any thoughts on Equatorial Guinea. I had a brief career as a freelance oil industry analyst, and I wrote about Equatorial Guinea, and I can't recall the details because it's easy in my mind to, was it Equatorial Guinea, or was it Congo Brazzaville, or was it this other small small West African country that I'm trying to think of that is also big on oil and gas. Equatorial Guinea, my understanding is it's big on oil and gas. Did it have one of the longest ruling strongmen, or is that a different country? So yeah, I'm afraid I can't parse out my thoughts on Equatorial Guinea at this point, Darahuhu. I haven't had many recent thoughts on Equatorial Guinea. I did research it at some point, and as I recall, it's a pretty desperately unequal and poor place despite massive oil and gas wealth. Thoughts on New York elections? That's a great question, Angel Balanzar, and I am really ashamed to say that I don't have any thoughts on New York elections. Part of the reason I moved back to the United States was I wanted to be in a place where I could be more engaged with politics and more interested and on top of what was going on and being able to participate. You know, this is a channel that obviously takes politics very seriously, and I keep meaning to get more involved in just following New York politics, and I keep failing to do that. I had an interesting conversation recently with a person who works for the New York City government, and my understanding is that Adams is just a disaster. Generally speaking, Adams was sort of trumpeted by the New York Post and the Economist as this sort of charismatic, oh, he's going to be really helpful on crime because he's a police officer. And yeah, he seems to a lot of the interest and good feeling towards Adams. I guess he was just elected. Was he elected last fall? And just took office maybe 6 to 8 months ago. And I think already he's seen as being kind of a clown. But no, I have not been following New York elections. I know there's a lot of excitement about a New York special election in New York for the U.S. House of Representatives, for the U.S. legislature, where a Democratic candidate in a bellwether region, there's so much of the United States that you know who's going to win, whether it's Republican or Democrats. These few parts, upstate New York is one, or the border between upstate New York, which tends to be more Republican, and downstate New York, which is exclusively Democratic. There's a few border counties there, and this district is one of them. They're called bellwether counties because you actually don't know who's going to win there. And in one of them, a special election, a Democratic politician did better than Biden did, and also won that seat. And is being seen as like a tremendously positive influence for the midterms. In the U.S. midterms, folks have moved from being absolutely certain a year ago that after Biden's plummet in approval ratings because of the U.S. media's insane attack against him over doing the right thing and getting us out of Afghanistan. After all of that, sorry, I'm fading off a little bit here. It's been over an hour and a half. After that, it seemed very likely that the Democrats were going to get wiped out in the midterm elections in 2022. I was always a little doubtful of that because the big shift is that the Democrats have picked up a lot more affluent suburban folks, and it seems like Trump is still very much a factor in the Republican Party. And its affluent suburban folks are traditionally the people who vote in midterms. So I was always less convinced that there'd be a massive Democratic wipeout. Now people are pretty convinced, largely because the Republicans have picked such terrible candidates, that the Democrats are going to hold on to power in the Senate. And there's even a distinct chance that they'll hold on to the power in the House of Representatives as well. This is something I'd very much like to see happen. That'd be a very good thing. But who knows how likely that is, how possible that is. It's entirely possible that the Democrats will still get creamed. And this New York special election, to bring it back there, was seen as another hopeful data point for the Democrats. I don't know how much you can extrapolate a single special election to the midterms, but we'll see. Sarah Pulsaro asked, whatever happened to Juan Guaido? He was front and center in the anti-Maduro protests, and now he's seemingly disappeared. I think that despite the fact that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February, the Biden administration started sending diplomatic envoys to the Maduro government, but I think U.S. policy is still technically that Guaido is the president of Venezuela, which seems more and more ridiculous with every passing day, especially now that Colombia, the sort of linchpin of the anti-Maduro coalition, is now run by Petro. Did I mention this? That over the past week, Petro has opened Colombian and Venezuelan diplomatic relations again, which had been closed for a couple of years. So this is yet another step in Juan Guaido's. Juan Guaido, for those who may not know, was I think he was a member of the parliament that was disbanded by Maduro, and then the U.S. government, in accordance with most of our allies, just announced that Guaido, I think he was selected with parliamentary acquiescence or whatnot, that Guaido was the president of Venezuela, and everybody should deal with Guaido, and their embassies should go to Guaido's people. And the Venezuelan government was like, "The fuck? We're still here," and I think the Trump administration was expecting some kind of coup, overthrowing the Maduro government, and that was total failure. And I think Guaido's still running around pretending to be the Venezuelan president. I haven't looked into him recently, but yeah, he's becoming a somewhat sad or comical figure, depending on your politics. Sisi is building a useless new city in the desert, says Fado. Yeah, that's definitely something that Sisi is doing. Of course, what's allowing him to do that, even imagine doing that, is massive Gulf funding. So it's kind of interesting that it's a Gulf-style political choice being made in Egypt. It's a sort of almost, you could see it actually sadly as a sort of further indication of Egyptian subjugation to Gulf sort of governing ways and approaches and priorities. During the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, actually probably right up to the Camp David Accords, when Egypt made a sort of peace with Israel, Egypt was the leading Arab country, indisputably. It's almost its natural position as the most populous Arab country. There are 100 million Arabs in Egypt versus, 35, 40 million in Saudi Arabia. Yeah, so by far the larger, I guess Morocco and Algeria are also 40 million countries, Egypt 100 million. They've been losing that position for 40 years now, and Mubarak, also a dictator, was at least somewhat independent of the Gulf states and could disagree with them occasionally. But Sisi owes his continued power. This is a much even more violent dictator than Mubarak that took power in 2013, and the reason he was able to rise to power and the reason he's able to maintain himself in power is largely direct funding from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. It's especially depressing when you consider that the first era of the Cold War in the Middle East was known as the Arab Cold War, and that was a Cold War between Egypt and Saudi Arabia primarily. And now, I mean, that conflict couldn't be any more dead, as Egypt is just a paid-off subject of Saudi Arabia, U.S. colony. It's really quite sad. Fado says, Morsi, this is the Egypt's only ever democratically elected president that was turfed out. Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe there's some, what happened in the 20s and 30s. It was turfed out in 2013. Morsi had some good action plans. It's a shame his administration was blocked from implementing them. Egypt would have been so much better off today. I agree that Morsi would have been vastly better for Egypt than what ended up happening. But it's important to acknowledge that Morsi also kind of screwed up his time in power, as presumably anybody attempting to be the first democratically elected president of Egypt would have done. It's absolutely inexcusable that he was, kicked out of power and murdered. It took, I think, 5 or 6 years for him to die in prison, but he eventually died in prison. Pie the Base says, can't comment on Sisi because I like being alive. Good point. Egypt is really, Sisi came to power with a much more horrific massacre than Assad has ever been accused of. 1,000 people killed in a single day who were peaceful supporters of the elected president. I think there's some arguments that maybe it was a chemical attack or two that killed more people in Syria by Assad, but that's in the context of an ongoing civil war, and Assad was, to the extent that Syria had one, was the legitimate leader of the country. Sisi took power from the legitimate leader of the country and killed 1,000 people in a single afternoon. really horrific stuff. I've had journalist friends over the course of the Sisi regime, starting in 2013. I lived in Istanbul in 2013 and 2016, and I had a series of, I hung out with a lot of journalists, and I would make these new friends because people moved from Syria, because people moved from Egypt to Turkey, not because, as Western journalists, not because they felt that they were personally in danger, but because anybody who talked to them would be killed. Egypt is a really just disgustingly authoritarian, really grim, dark place right now. But, you know, U.S. allies, so we never talk about it. Morsi died in prison because of no health care. He went blind in one eye, I think. I think that's the appropriate approach to Morsi. I don't like the guy, but we still voted for him. He was the legitimate democratically elected president of Egypt, and we supported a coup to throw him out and replace him with one of the more violent and horrific dictators that the Middle East has ever seen. What are your thoughts on the Iran nuclear deal? I support it. I've made long videos about it. I actually, put together like an hour-long magnum opus in its support about a year ago. I'd love for it to come back into effect, but I'm beginning to lose faith that that's a possibility. I'm beginning to stop believing, unfortunately. The current scuttlebutt is that we're closer than we've ever been before. The problem is that we're dealing with a clock that's running down. If the JCPOA had started again in January of 2021, there would have been a 4-year period before a new Republican president could come in and ruin it. That would have been 4 years of the possibility of building economic ties, connections, importantly, U.S. business, U.S. money getting invested in the Iranian market and being able to shut down Republicans who wanted to bring back war with Iran. I have less and less confidence that even if the JCPOA does come back, now we're in September of 2022, so then in January, he said, it's going to take 6 months to implement, it's going to take a year for any real benefits to accrue, and then we've got maybe 2 years before a Republican president could potentially come in and destroy it. I don't know. I'm getting less and less, it seems less and less viable. It seems like Iran gets less and less out of it. Sudan and Iraq are the second and third largest Arab countries, respectively. Are you sure about that? Saudi Arabia has been growing in population very quickly. Egyptians are good at building slums. I'm quite impressed, actually. They build some of the tallest slums in the world. That's interesting. By the basis, slums is a pretty subjective word, so I would agree. Morocco recalled its ambassador to Tunisia. Jesus, that's another thing I'm not following at all. So Tunisia is just being absolutely screwed by the fact that, after their democracy was absolutely screwed and deprived of resources by the IMF and the world for quite some time. Dictator took over about a year ago and now is realizing that nobody wants to help him either. So now he's trying to cozy up to Algeria, which is his neighbor, which is a very interesting choice. And I would argue sort of an unwise one, because I think, looking at the writing on the wall, it seems like Algeria is becoming more and more isolated. But I don't know. I guess it's a sign of the desperation of Tunisia's government. I haven't seen any interpretations of what happened. Was the Tunisian government chose to, I believe, have a high-level diplomatic meeting with Polisario element, and of course it's Polisario that believes it owns Western Sahara, a chunk of territory that Morocco annexed, 50 years ago? And this annexation was recognized by the U.S. government in return for some kind of normalization with Israel. I think Tunisia has been knocking a lot of doors, asking for more money and support. Algeria actually has some money. And I think it might be sort of Tunisia's last resort, which is why they're taking the actions they're taking. All right, we are down to the last 10 minutes or so, and I am losing steam. At this point, I guess I'll start pitching. If there are any more super chats, I'll keep talking I'll keep answering any super chat questions, but I think I am... Juan Paulo de Carvalho Araujo says, hey man, I really like your content, but I still don't know your name. Also, what are your thoughts on Brazil and how our elections relate to U.S. and Latin America? My name is Robert Morris. That's my name, Robert Morris. My thoughts on Brazil is that I would like Lula to win the election. I would like Brazil to have a peaceful transition of power, or even if Bolsonaro somehow wins the election, for that to be peaceful as well. That is my fondest hope, but I think it's clear that Bolsonaro is a clown, which was clear a long time ago. New video, Modi is India's Erdogan. That's an interesting idea, but I don't know that Modi's really been as successful as Erdogan has. What serious issues has Modi resolved other than just being more brutal than Muslims? Yep, Super Jazz. Hi, my name is Robert Morris. I do something here every Tuesday. I've got a Twitter account at RoboLaw that I spend way too much time on. But I always like trying to get more people to follow me over there. Please do. The conversation continues all week long. This channel is mostly supported by a Patreon account. It is a crowdfunding, an ongoing crowdfunding thing. You folks agree to contribute a certain amount of money, from $1 to $10, for each produced video that I make. I don't charge for live content like this or rant content. It's only produced videos that I charge for. What the hell am I talking about? Where was I? Patreon, yes. Please sign up for that. It's really useful and it keeps this channel going. The thing about Patreon is that there are two incentives that we provide. We only do generally one or sometimes two public live chats, but the patrons get access to the patrons only newscast every month, where I try to cover everything that folks want me to cover. It's a lot of fun. It's a similar format to this, except I respond and answer every single comment. And we cover like a dozen separate issues instead of just 3 as we did today. Also, there's a patrons-only Discord server, which I've really come to enjoy in recent months. Nice thing about having a patrons-only Discord server is that the level of conversation is a lot higher than what I've seen on other Discord servers. Just a lot of really smart people, really care a lot about geopolitics, providing more information about the causes and the countries that matter to them. It's become a really valuable research tool for me. A lot of the information talking about Colombia and Iraq today is almost exclusively stuff that I got from patrons on the Discord, Fadel and Scott Locks in particular. Yeah. James R23 says, I can't super chat today. I just switched jobs. That's entirely, yeah, man, like, people got to work, man. This is exclusively a luxury good over here. Very grateful for all support that folks give, but you should never be putting yourself in financial damage to help keep this channel going. There's the Discord server, which I really love, and also additional to the patrons only newscast, there's a patrons only chat that we do, like a Zoom chat. I don't prepare anything for that. I just hang out for a couple hours once a month. And I get to sort of see the faces, hear the voices of the folks who keep this channel going. It's very cool. So yeah, Patreon, I got a TikTok, I got an Instagram, More Freedom Foundation. The YouTube channel, confusingly, is Mo Freedom Foundation, because there was a character limit when I started this channel a decade ago. It's More Freedom Foundation on Instagram and TikTok. I also have written a number of books, and you should check them out. I honestly don't have the energy to go find them right now. Avoiding the British Empire, which is sort of my stealth history of the world, talks about how the British and U.S. empires are much more familiar, and the United States is getting distressingly close to making the same sorts of mistakes that led to the world wars after the British world system. Also, everybody's lying about Islam, which talks about the Saudi-U.S. relationship and how it's at the root of almost all terrorism or what have you that we used to care so much about before we started caring about Russia and China. Fadl, I missed your super chat. Okay, Fadl says the UAE is selling the Arab world off for scraps. I think that's very true. I think that the UAE and Saudi Arabia, to an extent, the UAE is probably more successful at it. They don't care about anything other than their own domestic stability, which is purchased, and preserving the viability of monarchism, absolute monarchy. A truly medieval, old-time practice that almost exists nowhere else. And I think it's to the eternal shame of the United States that these are our main proxies in the Middle East. These are the main people we act and work with. Sure, we're very close to Israel, but Israel's very limited in what it can do in the Arab world. Our main pals, our main tools in the Arab world are these Gulf monarchies that have no interest other than crushing democracy. Which is a really, yes, I'm well aware that the United States often falls short of its higher principles, but in this case, we're just so crapping all over it. Oh man, Pakistan, I didn't talk about Pakistan at all. Incredible climate crisis, incredible disaster. Yeah, it's very sad. What I'm interested in is like, okay, so this is supposedly in part melting glaciers. So how much of Pakistan's glaciers are melting? Like, is this going to lead to serious water problems in future years? I don't know. Haven't seen much good reporting on that yet, but we'll see. China's heat wave is also kind of insane. Yeah, anyway. It's been 2 hours. There are no more super chats. Very grateful to all of you for showing up here. Did not realize how beat I was. Well, sort of very confusing prep for this, trying to do 3 separate countries in not particularly good depth. I appreciate you all bearing with me and being here. And I am out. Thank you so much. Y'all are the best.